Can you see me? Do I show up there? Okay, good. All right. So sorry about those technology issues. I still don't quite have them all resolved, but we're going to start anyway. So welcome everyone to the very first official presentation of the Fraser Lecture Series, Knowledge from the Blackfoot Confederacy, Nitspoaxin, Breath of Our Ancestors. And I get the pleasure to introduce Amonisiaki, Dr. Annie Belcourt, and she's a professor at the University of Montana, and she'll tell you a little bit more about herself when she comes up. But we're just so grateful for her to be here today and to join us. And she's got a wonderful topic that we're going to talk about. And then following her presentation, we're going to do a little bit of a reset, and then Dr. Mike Brewsted and Dr. Belcourt will get together and have a conversation, and it's going to morph into whatever it morphs into. And we did this yesterday, and it was just beautiful. So with that, Dr. Belcourt.
Okay, yay! Our technology, woo! So can folks hear me okay? Okay, because I'm not sure, I won't use this extra microphone if I don't need. Okay, great. First of all, I just want to briefly introduce myself and also recognize our elder, Nina Biksai, for your wonderful prayer, and just really thank the people of the Lummi Nation and Nooksack communities who are hosting this event and hosting our gathering, the next couple of days. I'm deeply honored to be here. Wonderful thanks to our relative, Kristen, and to Will, and to all of those who have done the work to organize this wonderful lecture series. I'm so honored and excited to be here this week to hear from the perspectives of our elders, our practitioners, our community members, and each of you as we have time to share, to discuss these topics. So a little bit about me, Oki Nistu Nadaniko Amanisaki. So my name is Otter Woman, and I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I trained at the University of Montana. I did a year of postdoctoral internship at the Denver VA, where I worked with a lot of mostly combat veterans. So I'll tell you a little bit about that work and that journey, and then also about just some of the work that I've been doing in the past few years as a professor and a researcher. And so part of that journey has led me here and to my relative Kristen, that we didn't know we were related. So both Mike, Kristen, and I are all, and many others are descendants from folks who survived the Bear River or the Baker Massacre, which you may have heard about in history books. And there were, in my case, I descend from Insamaki or Cecile Yellow Wolf, Yellow Kidney later, who was able to survive that massacre and walk with her sister Louise to Fort Benton and eventually to Fort Shaw in Montana to survive, and without their sacrifice I wouldn't be here. So I like to recognize and acknowledge my ancestors who have helped me to become a voice for our Native people, and that's what I try to do, is just provide some insights and some discussion around some of the things that I have found to be really important for me. So this first image is a photo from our three sisters. So what a wonderful gift that you have in the artwork here, where you have the three sisters. I am multi-tribal myself. I'm Blackfeet on my father's side and Chippewa, which is where the Belcourt comes from. Although my grandfather, Alec Belcourt, was adopted by Old Man Arrowtop for the Blackfeet. So he grew up, he knew our Blackfeet culture and Blackfeet way of life. And then my mom is Mandan Hidatsan from North Dakota. And so those four tribes have been really important to me. And in our community of Missoula, where I teach at the University of Montana, we have a community garden, and we have a Three Sisters garden that has corn and Mandan varietal of corn that we've been able to reclaim and rematriate into the soil. And then we have squash, Hidatsa squash, that we also grow. And let's see, I think it's the Mandan beans that we also have. So different specific plant medicines that we have. And that's actually my sister Jamie's Indian name is a Mandan name. That is Magikashash, and that's Three Sisters in our Mandan language. So it's with that, some of that history that I want to share with you today, some of my journey. I started out life, I guess, somewhat near the ocean. I was actually, I was born in North Dakota, and then my dad went to graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, and which is very odd for his time because he grew up in Star School, Montana. And if you've been to Montana or Glacier National Park, Star School is a very small town. There's no stores, there's one church and a school, and that's where I went to school. I went to elementary school there. So we had mixed grades. This is really dating myself. And, that was a really magical experience, actually, because we had really, Earl Old Person is from Star School, so we grew up with all of Old Persons and many different families. And so that was our background. And where I grew up, like specifically, is an area of land right outside of Glacier National Park, and it's by Holmgren Ridge, which is our family name, is Holmgren, and Red Blanket Hill. So that's kind of where I am situated. It's right 6 miles outside of Glacier National Park. So the work I'm going to talk about today is about health. As a clinical psychologist, this has been a major area of focus for me is post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as resiliency within American Indian communities. And so that's what I'll kind of start with. The work that I have done has started in graduate school and continued on to today. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I'm going to start with that research and then kind of go through a little bit about health disparities, because what I found is that not everyone is as familiar with Montana as well as the health of our Indigenous peoples in Montana. So this is just a little schematic of the tribes within Montana. The reservation, as we know, is, artificially identified. For our Blackfeet people, of course, it was really the whole state that we were traditionally territory, and for the Blackfeet, we were very much one of the last tribes to really be overcome by the white government, the federal government, and European Americans. This I thought was just interesting. So this comes from the Department of Health and Human Services, a map. And what I was struck by was the fact that they said percent of whites alone. So that gives you a sense of how Montana approaches our Indigenous communities, that there's a mentality that we are still contained in an apartheid system, that we live in restricted areas of the state, that we are not recognized oftentimes as human and oftentimes as still existing in Montana. We have within our Constitution the requirement that our tribal histories be taught in the schools. However, it is done in such a way that is not frequently effective. So, and it certainly does not teach any kind of anti-racism within our state. So we have a lot of border towns that are adjacent to a lot of our reservation communities that are very much a part of the system of violence that is enacted and continue to be enacted against American Indian people. And so that's what I have focused on a lot, is historical trauma as well as contemporary exposure to trauma within American Indian communities. So I'm really grateful to kind of share some of the insights that we have from the work that we've done in this area, and to think about the ways that we can truly decolonize from the process of violence exposure that has been enacted against our people across this continent and others. So the first I wanted to talk about is our Ikakimat study. And so for our study, this is, Amskapi Pakani data from our community that we were able to, over many years. So I have had funding from the National Institute of Health, pretty much until the last 3 years. In the last 3 years, I became the chair of Native American Studies for the University of Montana, which I just stepped down from last summer, thank God. I will come back to, but what I wanted to talk a little bit about is that, I started in graduate school where I looked at cognitive vulnerability theories to depression. So a lot of very cognitive focused learning-based theories of depression and psychopathy. And what that is a very jargony way of saying, like, the ways that we struggle and the human ways that we struggle with stress in particular. And what the animal studies in this domain show is that if an animal is in an environment where they're continually exposed to significant stressors, in this case, a shock to the foot that is painful, over time, if they don't have a way to escape that stressor, they will develop sort of a depression-like symptoms, and they will become lethargic. They will become shut down. They will become ultimately appearing hopeless, and they can't escape the stressor. So that has been applied to human models of depression, and how we understand depression in ways that can be very important clinically to look at, right? So when we think about depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, it's important to think that we have human and we have sort of mammalistic fish actually to responses to exposures to trauma. And so for those of us who come from Indigenous communities, we are intergenerational survivors of that trauma, and that trauma has made an impact. And as we're learning about the epigenetics of trauma and the ways that our bodies will change in the ways that they respond to trauma, it is very important for us to think about not only the neurobiology of that constellation of effects, but also the ways that it impacts the community in social ways, in the ways that we treat each other, in the ways that we see each other. So this study was a study that emanated from work that I did at the University of Colorado. I was there for 5 years as part of their, what we call clinigraphy team at the time. So it was a group of both clinicians, we had psychiatrists, psychologists, and anthropologists who were part of that team. And we had a data set of over 3,000 Native people who we did very extensive clinical interviews with. And then we coded all of those interviews. We did psychometric analyses and to look at the different kind of risk factors. And what we found was, of course, multifaceted, but what we found is that there are some factors that consistently help people become resilient to stress and trauma. And we also found that there are consistently things that help people, unfortunately, have more challenges. And as we know, and we'll talk about for Montana, that has had a significant lasting effect for our communities. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I prepared some of these slides for a meeting that the NIH held in Hamilton, Montana, at one of their national labs. And we had the head of NIH and the Tribal Health Research Office there, which is really cool because they could learn a little bit about some of this work. So I had a fellowship with Harvard that was also looking at environmental health. And that fellowship was called the JPB Foundation. And it's very interesting. For those of you who've done foundation work, it's a foundation that started with the Ford, I believe, it may have been the Ford, no. Anyway, long story short, it is a very wealthy foundation that's been able to do work in democracy, poverty, and environmental kind of aspects. But it comes from, what is the one guy who did the, Madoff, a family who profited from the Madoff scheme. So it's one of their ways to try to correct some of that kind of situation. But I'm very fortunate because, I was able to get a fellowship that allowed me to be the only Indigenous scholar in the country who was focusing on environmental and social science studies. And what I did is worked with others to create an environmental health and psychiatric epidemiology survey where we looked at both of these factors within our communities. We also, it's nice being here because we also worked with the Swinomish community to develop a rapid response measure for air quality situations because they had a very large air quality pollution event, I think it was in 1999, where a lot of the tribal members had become very sick and become very ill due to exposures from the oil refinery that's near their reservation community. It essentially dumped this hydrogen sulfide, I believe it was, into the community, and people became sick. And this fellowship had a lot of epidemiologists and toxicology scientists, and I was one of the few social scientists, and we came in and developed ways for them to develop digital storytelling, rapid monitoring, those sorts of things from a science perspective, but also ways to engage the community. That's a long story to say, not very much has actually been done in science and in the intersection of environmental science and culture. And it used to be the case when I just finished graduate school in 2006, 20 years ago, we were just talking about that, that people at the time thought that culture did not matter. And culture was a non-significant variable, that race was something that we had quote unquote conquered as far as the ways that race impacts communities. And I had the opportunity to work with scholars from across the country who are studying race and the impact of racism on communities of color. And so that was a very important thing for me. We did a study with 380 Blackfeet people on our community over 2 years, where we developed this measure. We collected data. We met with the community and developed the measures so that it would have both climate change factors that were measured, as well as social stressors. So and that was because, as we know, Native people, we don't really separate those into silos. We really view health as a holistic kind of entity, and our relatives within the, animal and environmental world are considered part of our universe, and we talk to them, and as Mike had described, those are part of who we are as Blackfeet people, and as many Native people communities are. So we looked at this, we looked at the relationship to health, mental health, culture, and resiliency. And what we found was, here's the thing about social science, we don't really find anything super surprising. We usually find things that you would guess, so what we guessed and what we found was that our hypothesis around trauma was very much consistent with what we found. We found that those who had experienced trauma had poorer health. And that makes a lot of sense from a clinical, from every kind of standpoint you can think about. Higher levels of depression, PTSD, and health issues that were associated with environmental exposure. And this included, we did some biomarker measures, we did blood pressure, we did BMI, we did A1C. And we were able to actually help people within the community recognize if they had hypertension issues. So we had pharmacy on hand so they could get their referrals, as well as A1C if they had high blood sugars that were concerning and get. There were a number of people who probably would qualify for diabetes. You have to have multiple points of measurement to qualify for that. But that is concerning because this was not a clinical sample. This was just a regular, everybody who wanted to volunteer sample. What we also found is that resiliency was something that was very apparent. And this is something that I found in both my master's thesis and dissertation research, is that what we would expect to see with the levels of significant trauma exposure, we actually were finding the opposite. We were finding that people were experiencing a level of resiliency and adaptive coping that surprised us, given the fact that we were seeing people with very high, what we call ACE, or adverse childhood experience scores. And we also found that specifically when you carve down to what are the factors that were most effective, culture and participation in ceremony, language, all of the things that Mike has described and talked about are the things that exactly will protect our community members very, very significantly. We found that 40% of our participants were gathering plant medicine for food, for teas, for ceremonies. We found that people who participated, we only asked about a couple of ceremonies, but the Okan in particular we asked about, which is our medicine lodge, or Sundance it's sometimes called, was one of the most highly related to the protective factors that we measured. So this, as a scientist and a clinician, was a very important finding for me. It's telling me a couple of things that are very significant. One is that we have to invest our resources into providing pathways to access traditional ceremonial knowledge, our language, our culture, our lifeways. Those are the things that will help our mental health and our physical health for our communities. We did another study where we funded, this is a completely different study that the University of Washington did with tribes across the country. They did a tribal college and university study where they surveyed thousands, again, of Native people. And what they found, this is from the Blackfeet subsample, so I was able to find funding and we did the similar kind of analyses set. And we found that depression, suicidal ideation, and PTSD were related to ACE scores, higher ACE scores, which again, you would expect. But this is where kind of things were a little different. We also measured everyday discrimination. And again, you keep in mind the context. These are all Native people who are all living on the reservation who had answered all of these questions. And so what we saw was that lateral forms of violence within the community was the most predictive key factor for risk. So when you think about that clinically, that really starts to tell you that there's a picture emerging that we are kind of losing the scope of the significance. So the more that we have internalized historical trauma, the boarding school experience, the more that we have experienced those forms of violence that shape family dynamics over time, that increase substance abuse, that increase those ways of avoiding symptomology, that we are harming ourselves. We know in Montana, we have the highest suicide rate in the country, competing with Alaska. And one of the things we know is, unfortunately, that is a form that is self-homicide. And we sometimes don't think about that, but it's an act of violence towards the self. And that comes from years of conditioning, and conditioning that is aimed at dismantling our love for ourselves as people. And that to me is unacceptable. Because one of the things that we as parents have, have to kind of care about is the fact that we want to give the love that we can to our children. And one of the things that interferes with that process as a developmental kind of psychology approach is the fact that we have been conditioned to not see ourselves in media, not see ourselves in literature, not see ourselves in governance, not see ourselves in all of the ways that matter to American citizens and citizens in Canada. And that leaves a mark. And many of our Native children grow up not knowing who they are. They think that their culture is something other than Indigenous culture. They idealize and sometimes violence. And because of some of the things I'll talk about and kind of dismantle some of the social determinants of health. But one of the key factors is identity and identity development. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. And that's why this event and events like this are so important as we think about identity of institutions to help decolonize some of the ways that we have been conditioned to view Indigenous people as less than, other than, and to be self-harming in these different ways. So how does this impact health? In Montana, our life expectancies are much shorter. So for the national average for non-Native people, it's above 70 to 79, depending on gender. In Montana, it's 60 to 63 years of age. We have a great deal of diversity, of course, within the 574 different tribes, but there's also a lot of shared history of risk, resiliency factors as well. But we are overrepresented in foster care in Montana. it's been estimated that we make up about 5 to 6% of the population, but 30 to 40% of those children in foster care. And similarly with incarcerated American Indians, about 20 to, upwards of 30% of the incarcerated population. Our mortality is higher, our morbidity is higher, and we live shorter, more challenging lives. That's not something that anyone can deny. All of the statistics will demonstrate that. This is a little bit of what the kind of leading causes of death are for people in Montana. And this is, like I was saying at lunch, this is like the depressing part, so stick with me. We'll come back to the more hopeful part. But, this is kind of a tabulation of deaths that occurred. So this is kind of showing you how the median death rate is occurring by gender. This is mortality causes over different ages. And some of the differences that you'll see in terms of the demography is that unintentional injury for infants to actually neonatal to 24 is the leading cause of mortality. And suicide being second, and then there's other causes that are kind of collapsed within that. But we also have perinatal conditions being a big issue, and homicide. For ages 25 to 44, we see, again, unintentional injuries, and this is different from other populations. We don't see these same patterns in other communities other than those who are marginalized within the United States and Canada. We see heart disease, liver disease as people are getting older. You see different forms of cancer, and we also see a large discrepancy in those who have died due to COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. And a lot of this is due to a lack of access to clean water, overcrowded homes. We're seeing now hantavirus and other zoonotical diseases that impact our communities. And these are really extremely problematic when you think about the poverty rates within our communities. So these are some of the unintentional injury deaths. If you kind of break this down, motor vehicle crashes is a very large one, especially not using seatbelts or car seats for infants and children. Falls, accidental poisoning, which is completely, unfortunately, accounted for by drug and alcohol overdoses. So these are some of the things that we're facing. And I don't doubt that these are similar patterns to what communities here face as well. We see our communities have, in terms of social justice, been forgotten and been marginalized. And what I will say is that even though for those of us who come from our communities, this is sort of common sense, and I'm preaching to the choir, most people don't know about these things and these patterns and how it translates directly to quality and quantity of life. This is the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and how it impacted American Indian, Alaska Native communities. And what we see there is, unfortunately, the black line on each of the scales is American Indian, Alaska Native communities. And we were, unfortunately, the highest in terms of both morbidity and mortality. So that is something that is not spoken about enough. Like in places, especially in Alaska and Navajo Nation in the Southwest, that the water is oftentimes polluted in some areas. We have uranium and arsenic poisoning that happens in wells in, of course, the Southwest. And in Alaska, there's a lot of folks who just don't have running water and are living in one-room cabins, and sometimes with the toileting in the same room. So we know that there's a lot of issues with exposure from a public health perspective. So these are really significant factors that continue to face to this day. I mentioned this to Mike this morning, but in our community, it was reported that we just had a 4-year-old, this was 2 months ago, who died of starvation. And in this day and age that we have a child who's dying of starvation is, again, feels really unacceptable to me, and that we really as a community have to come together to change these patterns and these outcomes. One of the ways that the state of Montana has talked about changing some of these patterns is to help improve the social determining factors of health, reducing poverty, poor access to fresh foods. Many of us live in food deserts where we don't have access to fruits and vegetables and safe places to walk. Looking at individual trauma within many of our communities, we've heard a lot, or you've probably seen efforts to increase awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples. Unfortunately, that has only become an increasing problem within our communities, and especially in light of our presentation yesterday, the Violence Against Women Act has made incremental changes to help some of these issues, but the reality is that especially for a non-Native person can come to a reservation community and murder people and essentially get away with it and not be prosecuted. And the federal government is the group that is supposed to prosecute those cases, but they have a declination rate historically of 80 to 90%. So we're not seeing people who are held accountable for harming our people. And so that's something that we have to think about. Again, toxic stress, so this lateral violence, the ways that we're cruel to each other, to ourselves, the lack of trust, having risky behaviors. And again, that kind of comes back to when we think about PTSD, there's different domains of PTSD symptoms. So we think about hypervigilance, hyperarousal. We also think about avoidance. So when we have the fight, flight, or fawn response, which typically comes with people who've experienced any kind of trauma, those things happen at a biological level. And so we have activation of the limbic system, we have higher levels of cortisol, we have histamine disruption, we have mast cell activation, we have all of these different kinds of ways that are a constellation of stress. And for our Native people, it's not a good thing, especially when you take into account the fact that we may have reduced immunity to some of the kind of different viruses that are happening, because we do, we are native to this country and we weren't in Europe, and we did not have the same level of exposure to those things. Again, with the built environment, we think about physical activity, we think about dietary changes. It's very difficult. I know we all love food sovereignty, and I am the first to say that's such a wonderful thing. It's very expensive, and it's very prohibitively expensive. I also work on a campus, and even just to provide healthy, nutritious meals to our students is prohibitively expensive, of native foods, those sorts of things. So those are important factors. Commercial, non-ceremonial tobacco use is also something that can be problematic. And early deaths, we talk about some of these as well. So kind of looking at how do we change some of these factors. Historical trauma is hard to intervene with because it has happened generations ago. However, we do know that there are very effective ways to treat PTSD. There are very effective ways to treat many trauma-associated conditions. And we don't, unfortunately, see a lot of those things happening and a lot of access to counseling or mental health care happening within our reservation communities. So this is just a study that the state of Montana did where they looked at ACE scores, they looked at a measure called HOPE, which is health outcomes with positive experiences, so kind of looking at both of the sides of the spectrum, and they found how that related to substance abuse and physical activity. And I can send you these slides because they're kind of detailed and everything, but we see the same pattern. So that's the thing, as we're thinking about pattern recognition. So we think about how we can intervene within these different patterns of risk. Some of the key aspects are looking at dismantling systematic oppression, right? That's a big thing. And anytime I mention that to students, they don't love that idea because how do we reduce racism, right, in a world that is quite racist? But that is one of the things that we can do, is we can actually show our children and our communities that social determinants can change. We can make investments in community that can decrease poverty. We know that from history. We know that we can reduce racism by helping to prosecute and hold accountable those who are acting in ways that are systematically discriminatory or racist towards particular communities or individuals. We can also think about reducing economic barriers In the United States, we have reservations that are acting on a way of apartheid, right? And it's oftentimes very difficult to start a business in our reservation communities. And ways to, stimulate that economy can really help the public health side of things. And then the politics of colonization, we have all participated in or seen these forms of lateral violence within our communities. And, we have to kind of invest in ways that we can become interventionists at the bystander level and not let those things pass, because even though they may seem harmless, they oftentimes hurt real people, and we don't realize the way that those identity attacks and identity threats can really harm our communities. This is just a little bit of data from our state, and I'm not sure how it looks in Washington, but basically the bottom row is the state of Montana and some of the different indices of poverty. We look at overall poverty rate, unemployment rate, and those who are eligible for free and reduced lunches. And this will look really different in some ways, maybe right now, but what you see is that each of our reservations compared to the state of Montana overall are at a very significant disadvantage. There's systematic disadvantage to all of our communities and our Indigenous people across the state. And the only community, the Flathead Reservation, that looks a little better is also the most checkerboarded state, where those who own the land, who are usually non-native, kind of artificially inflate some of the health data that we see from that. So this is very significant. And when you think about these factors, and you'll see some of the speakers tomorrow and Friday be able to talk about some of the community-based interventions that are happening within our community and really helping to kind of dismantle some of this at a community level. When we think about violence in our communities, more than 4 in 5 experience violence across their lifetime, significant clinical defined violence. Women and men have been victimized at similar rates, and psychological aggression and physical violence by intimate partners is the most common form of exposure, and it's also, from a psychiatric epidemiology standpoint, the most harmful type of exposure to have. So we see also sexual violence, stalking, these different types of things that are significantly problematic within our communities. So that's a lot. And sorry to be like this person talking about, but since we're in a learning institution, I think it's really important that we think about this. So let's step back and kind of think about, well, what is trauma? And when we talk about that, and we kind of throw that term out very frequently, but clinical forms of trauma are most commonly these forms of interpersonal assault, abuse, neglect is, if not more than, especially equal to physical forms of trauma and in terms of harm to children over time. Sexual assault, motor vehicle accidents, combat. Each of my uncles were in the military in Vietnam, and they were usually put in, we did studies in Colorado where we looked at PTSD rates, which were higher for Native veterans. But when you accounted for the fact that they were put in the most dangerous situations, they were viewed as throwaway, or like, that they were sacrificial, if you will. When you control for that, the differences disappeared. So it really comes back to that issue of Native people being treated differently. PTSD, again, has these different domains of symptoms: hypervigilance, sort of being on edge and feeling nervous, re-experiencing, having nightmares, having flashbacks, feeling like it's happening again, and then avoidance. Avoidance is one of the more profound and sort of sneaky symptoms that we have, because that can hide in things like alcohol use, gambling, drug use, being a workaholic, shopaholic, all the different aholics that we all can be guilty of. And it also can kind of become anxiety disorders like obsessive compulsive disorders, where we see combined kind of aspects of anxiety and thought disorder. So those are things that can really be problematic for all people. We also see and again, none of these are specific to Native communities, right? This is just like our, this is what happens with when people encounter trauma. But also developmental disorders, if people have any alcohol or drug exposure, we see a lot of that within our community with our youth as well. Cognitive impairment, neurological kind of issues, autism, those sorts of things. So this is just kind of like a snapshot clinically of what happens. With trauma, when it happens, we can have an acute response, which is the first month following a traumatic experience. And then past 6 months, we can, if we continue to have symptoms, and remember that this is a rare outcome clinically. Like most people are able to kind of cope adaptively to this. But if it's after 6 months that you're continuing to have significant symptoms, that then can qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. But for all people, we have a response to trauma. We have freeze responses that help us, to get ready, to be hurt, that kind of thing. Flight responses, allowing our body to be able to escape. We have that jack of cortisol and adrenaline and all those things. The fight response, which is something many of us have experienced, and the fawn response, which is not often talked as much about, but it is related to this constellation of reactions. And so the fawn response is one that's super interesting. And we were talking about a book that is called White Tears, Brown Scars, which is about white feminism and kind of the ways it has weaponized tears in some respects against people of color and communities of color. And I think that that's really important to think about because it is a way of trying to minimize the impact of a traumatic event, try to and so you'll see some of these kinds of responses. But with youth, it's really problematic because we are also trying to develop our identities as children, as youth, of course, over our lifespan, but when that is fragmented at an early age, it can, lead to further problems down the road. When we think about memory, a lot of clinicians think about PTSD as a form of a memory disorder. And the ways that we don't remember aspects of the trauma, we don't remember things because our limbic system is so highly activated. It kind of disconnects some of our connections to our neocortex, our ability to think in executive functioning kind of ways. So parts of our therapy and our work are helping people to rebuild those relationships to memory in positive ways and helping people to be able to process trauma in a way that they can then later talk about it in a way that is not as activating. Because part of what we see is with PTSD is our thresholds become much lower. And so when we have a loud noise or things, we may have a startle reflex because we're kind of hyper, ready to respond. And so that executive functioning portion can be particularly problematic for our young people. And I gave a talk with our probation and parole officers in Montana, and they had, I can't remember how many, they had 200 or so incarcerated youth in Montana, and of that, about 30 of them were Native or sort of mixed, in terms of their identities. And one of the things that really came across within talking to them was just how dysregulated a lot of the kids were. Just very chaotic styles of attachment, chaotic thinking, kind of just really difficult time making decisions, making, planning, things, thinking about the future, their future, and a lot of their time and energy really focused on surviving that day. And that makes sense from a clinical perspective, but that's where the clinicians can really kind of hone in on helping our kids. And that's one of the discussions we had with our probation officers was how can we think about being their executive function and helping to calm them, helping them to learn ways to disengage from the fight or flight response and helping to regulate their emotion systems so that they weren't kind of in this constant cycle of struggle to try to avoid the symptoms and symptom activators. So that's kind of some of the kind of clinical side of things that all of us can kind of work on. So the clinical aspects of trauma and development, and what is normal, what is not normal. As a scholar, I have to say, like, this is like hard to define, and all of you can recognize this, because a lot of what we define as normal is based on white communities and normed on white communities. And so, for an example, there's I mentioned attachment. A lot of the attachment literature is racially biased against communal styles of parenting, where within our Native communities, a lot of times parenting is a shared duty and job, and we all help and we pitch in and we help parent young ones. And that's not the case in the history of white psychology, that they really value individual goals. There's not as much communal goals. There's not as much communal parenting. And that's kind of viewed as a more maladaptive style of parenting. Same thing with like virtually any way of measuring anything within psychology. If you think about measuring intelligence, I think it's still I don't know, maybe wrong, but in the WISC and WAIS, the different intelligence measures, a couple of the items one of them was who was Columbus. And if a child or a person says, well, he was a person who enacted genocide in this community and this is, killed many Tayanos, and that would be scored 0, right? Because he discovered America. And that's the right answer. And that'll give you, your points. Similar things have happened with other standardized measures. So we have to kind of think about that and ways that we can invest in diversifying education, diversifying our understanding of psychology, getting people, like in the law discussion yesterday, so important to think about differential ways of understanding our reality and our worlds. And the fact that, our relationship to water, to air, to our bundles, to our sacred ceremonies are valid. They matter. And especially to our communities and our individuals within our communities, these are some of the ways that we can help people not develop some of these disorders. And that's important. So how can we best provide care that is trauma-informed? And this is like really, I think, the thing I want to definitely kind of leave you with, and I'm not sure where we're at with time. I kind of go and I lose track.
You're good. You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from my Savisberry or Saskatoon berry harvest last year. After I made my slides, I went back and I took out the AI slop and put real photos into my slides. So I'm very proud of that, because my family is a lot of artists and creative people, and that's like so important to, like, down with AI. But but those are literally things that we can do in terms of trauma-informed care, is we can invest in the people who are creatively thinking about solutions, who are creatively thinking about ways to inform science and scholarship in ways that heal our communities. And so I'm very aware that this is a healing space, and this is a healing house, and this is a space that, my hope for all of you is that we'll continue to have these hard discussions so that we can think about, how do we change these factors? How do we be very honest about the issues that we need to carve down, and change? And that is part of what we're thinking about, and how we heal and benefit our communities. When we think about risk factors, of course, substance use, lack of access to care, adverse childhood experiences, many of these things are not within our control, right? Social determinants of health, such as poverty and those things, those are more global issues that we all sort of need to work on. But some of the resiliency factors that are very much in our control is how, we think about faith, we think about culture, we think about social support, which is the underpinning of many of our cultural ceremonial ways of living. How do we build self-esteem and positive Native identity? How do we begin to think about dismantling some of these, unconscious processes oftentimes that have led our communities to adopt and enact violence towards each other or towards, ourselves in many regards. So those are some of the things that I have become a real believer in, and why I took 3 years off of my very kind of rigidly, I guess, research-focused pathway to think more about taking a deep dive into the cultural experience of Indigenous communities. And I think it's something that we can all do. Thinking about the richness of the community in terms of like the development of storytelling and, language knowledge, our songs, some of the things that our best clinicians in trauma research do are they teach people sort of like to play, to play music, to engage in theater, to move their bodies, to dance, to do these things that are like allowing them to be less intellectualizing and like less ruminating on some of these factors and more experientially getting off their devices and living. And there's a lot of environmental scientists who are beginning to study the impacts of the forest, right? And the telomeres that are like helping our brains heal, and some of these different ways that Indigenous ways of knowing have always known and practiced in terms of traditional knowledge. So why we smudge, why we drink these medicines, why we have tea, why we have, why, for example, when Mike smudged at home, a lot of times we have the badger jerky in a smudge box, right? And part of that, and Mike can tell us a lot better than he, so my apologies, Mike. I always feel weird presenting in front of elders, but it comes from one of our creation stories. So with the story of Scarface, and when he went back, and part of his journey was to have a scar removed from his face. And, this is a very short version of that piece. And he had to travel to the Lodge of the Sun. And along the way, this was back when we could still talk to animals, which I fully believe we can still, and I still do. And, but one of the animals he asked along the way was Badger, Misinski. And so he asked him, and he was willing to help him. And he brought him to Wolverine, and Wolverine brought him to the swans, who helped him to cross the big waters to the Lodge of the Sun. And that's why to this day, we use badger dirt when we pray, because that acts as a home that guides our prayers back up to the Lodge of the Sun and helps us to heal. And, most of us don't grow up knowing those stories. We don't have access to those stories. And that's part of what our healing is and our journey is to teach our children that they have that living within them, that the knowledge of, the fact that we are star people, that, our constellation is not called Cassiopeia, that's the path of Spider bringing, Feather Woman and her son down, to this world. And so, those are things that we can help share. We maybe don't share all of the things within our ceremonies, but some of the stories and the knowledge. And I've been very fortunate because, in my journey as chairing Native American Studies, I've been able to work with Mike and to work with many of our elders in Canada who were able to maintain most of our ceremonies. Here, I'm sure you guys are aware, but until 1978, from 1800s till 1978, it was illegal for us to practice our ceremonies, right? And so you could be arrested and detained for practicing our ceremonies. And my parents held an Okran ceremony in 1970, so they could have been arrested for holding the ceremony. So the ultimate resistance and reclamation work is in that work of helping our communities and our children build these factors back in their lives. Sorry, I need to drink water, but. So when we think about resilience and culture, and some of the kind of theme of these days is really how do we heal and how do we think about culture, language, and identity in communities. And these are things that we all think about every day, probably, and how can we work with existing systems to promote public health? So that comes back to that question, is how do we expect systematic changes for not only scientific equity, because this is like a lot of what we think about in research, but also educational equity and social justice. We have to kind of, a lot of times our Native communities really want us to look at just positive, sort of feel-good topics, if you will. And I'm on board with that. I grew up on my own reservation. I am very much in love with my culture and community. So I'm all down with healing and health. But we have to also start to think about these difficult questions and how do we engage with these topics in ways that will help our children to be brave and to speak about. As we've seen a lot of children who have been taught, not just Native children in our country, to not speak. And unfortunately, shame and avoidance of these difficult topics of child abuse, neglect, mistreatment, human trafficking, all of these things have led to where we're at today. That kind of shame is really kind of something that, as clinicians, we don't like to see. We don't like to see people shying away from the topics that we have to confront, not only for ethical reasons, for clinical reasons, because we know that those are the things that we're only as healthy as our secrets that we hold, and that's something that we kind of have to confront. This just kind of comes from more of a history. Again, you guys are very aware of these factors, but this is one of our elders from Canada who talked about this. Is it's a good opportunity to let the world know we're here, and that space is a representation of that voice and the empowerment, for lack of a better term, of communities to be able to share their vision. So as we think about sharing our histories of genocide and trauma, we also get to think about our legacies of resiliency and the stories of our ancestors. And in particular, you think about our ancestors and how they survived, what could be a massacre of, it was hundreds of our people. And for our Blackfeet, or Amskapi Pakani and Siksikaitapi, we are living in our homelands, and that's an amazing thing. Our stories are still living, not only within us, but within our landscape. And the same is true here. As we think about these profound losses, we also think about the ways that our community can continue to reclaim those voices. And that's not just a euphemism, but actually bringing those into reality. And culture matters, kind of coming back to that earlier statement I talked about where the sentiment was culture did not matter. Half of the sample in our studies have either begun to learn Blackfeet or speak some Blackfeet. 30% were attending different ceremonies. And this is kind of a list of just some of our ceremonies. We have many more now. But these are the strengths, and these are, again, a quote from one of the elders, and this came from a book that's about the Blackfeet, so it's just, I felt safe quoting that, But when we pray, we have songs for the sun, we have prayers, Kipitaki, Kokomiki Sam, for our moon, the Milky Way, where the wolf's pathway, and everything that's in our universe. And so those are ways that we share commitments to cultural preservation, to revitalizing our language. We have our immersion schools now that are teaching kids not only the language, but our culture. And the ways that can help resiliency are really profound. And our spiritual practices, here after 1978, we're still kind of in our infancy in trying to recover from the prohibition of who we are as Native people. And so bringing the renewal in these ways is so important. This is just, there's so many stories for Black Confederacy and people, and there's a lot of acknowledgement of how all of our different beings are connected. But for those of you who are familiar with our Blackfeet people, there's a lot of Napi stories that are shared, which can be really like a trickster story, like a coyote and what have you, where he's sort of ridiculous, but also instructive, right? These are the ways not to mess up. These are the things sort of to do, not to do, and some of the ways that we learn. But there's also our stories of Katoyes, which is, in a shorthand version, our Blackfeet superheroes, right? He had a little dog who traveled with him, and you know, making these kinds of stories accessible to our youth and to our communities is really important. We also have our spirit beings, our bundles. It's kind of hard to see there, but that's you know, key to our survivals. And just like the story of Makoi, and I was thinking about you with this slide, well, because you know, when we were created, there's a whole very involved series of creation stories for our Blackfeet people. Percy Bullchild is one of our people who wrote a book about that if you're interested. And there's, as our elders say, there's a G version, there's a R version, there's an X version of all of our creation stories. So be careful when you ask, because you'll get an answer you might not be prepared for. But you know, when we believe we were, you know, came to life, we were really pretty pitiful, and we were living in ways that were barely scraping by, so to speak, and didn't know how to hunt, didn't know how to work together. And one of the things that we were gifted was that our Makoi, our wolf people, had pity upon us, and they became human for a winter. And they taught us how to hunt together, how to work together, how to love each other, how to take care of each other, how to recognize the talent in each person. And that's going to be different for different people. And how, you know, the key to our survival and our renewal is within those relationships, within the ceremonies that help us renew our relationships to our plant world, to our underwater people, to our sky people. And it's in our language. You know, our language is a verb-based language, which kind of tells you it's less about the thing and more about the doing. And at the end of the winter, the wolves felt confident that they had transferred the knowledge of doing these communal hunts. And then they became the stars of the Milky Way to remind us of how to live our lives and how to help each other, how to live together, how to love each other. And at our ceremonies, that's what I think you really notice and you feel is the love that we have for each other. We kind of put aside our ego and all of our capitalistic, individualistic goals for that moment, and we come together and we say we're going to focus on the love that we have here. And when our elders talk about the smudge, that's what they say. That's Agomimstan. I might be saying that Agomimstan. Mike will be able to tell us. But that's another word that we think about is compassion. We have a Blackfeet word for compassion. We have culture, place, prayer, language, all of these things. And that's, as a clinician, what we teach, right? And we don't teach in psychotherapy per se, but we help people discover that these are some of the ways that we heal is through compassion for ourselves, compassion for other people, and those things lead to acceptance, you know. And we can't change everything, but we can accept certain things about ourselves and our histories and the scars that we might carry with us. So that's a lot of what we think about in public health too, is we think about increasing access to science and healthcare, to diversity and inclusion through informed practice. And the work that you're all doing here is just such an emblematic way of you know, viewing that process and that work. So those are kinds of some of the things we think about. And those are things that we can think about systematically. That shouldn't be exclamation point. I think it's a heart somewhere on a different version of this, but yeah, love, exclamation point. But you know, thinking about culture, storytelling, for a long time I got really into digital storytelling. So that's like some of the work that we've done in film and done some of that ceremony, language, economic, systematic kind of interventions, education, housing. You know, here, as we drove around the reservation community, or, you know, we saw some of the housing units that are communally designed. And I know in Swinomish, they're doing some of the similar design work for their longhouses in their communities. And those are really cool interventions because they think about the built environment as well as like increasing safety, increasing community focus. Here you have like, you know, the kitchen, the fish, you know, processing areas. I mean, those are all really great examples of how these things can happen. And really like how we can live as Makoi taught us which is having that compassion for ourselves and other people. And that's a lot of what we're doing when we're growing humans, is we're trying to think about ways that they can be compassionate and live with love for each other. And that's my daughter, Maya. So yeah, one of. So I wanted to like shift gears just briefly. I know you guys are probably tired and need a break, but there's, but we do think about compassion fatigue. I think we're in that right now as a culture. And so compassion fatigue is something where we feel worn out. I think I can speak for myself, but others probably, and you start to feel pretty burnt out at a certain point when you're dealing with this on a daily basis. And for a lot of Native scholars and teachers and parents, you're familiar with this. But, as your stress level kind of like begins to become too high, you begin to get into anxiety, exhaustion, burnout. One of my favorite authors is Viktor Frankl, who wrote about this. He was in, I believe, Auschwitz in one of the concentration camps, and he talks about this power that we have within ourselves to, choose, and that being something that we can't have taken away from us at some level. And so, for many communities are starting to look at how we can kind of grow and develop in positive ways in times of turmoil, such as today. And these are some of the things that we can work on with our kids, with our communities, with ourselves. But as a clinician, we talk a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy and how effective that is. So some of this is looking at how do we change our thought processes, how do we improve so that we're not doing all or nothing thinking, we're not overgeneralizing, like, oh, my car didn't start today, I'm a bad person. Like, like that kind of thing that it sounds ridiculous, but we all do on an unconscious level. Having a mental filter that's very negativistic is a big part of depression. So challenging ourselves to look at glimmers, look at hope, look at the joys that we have in every day. Dismissing positives can be something that happens. We can jump to conclusions. Oh, they must hate me because they didn't, X, Y, Z. Magnification or minimization, emotional reasoning. So this is really common, especially with trauma survivors. We see there's a famous psychotherapist called Meichenbaum who talked about don't should on yourself, because that's like, part of negative thinking, labeling, and then self-blame or blaming others for our issues, right? Taking our own accountability when there's things that we know we can change. And that's a lot of what we try to teach, and I teach in my classes these ideas of, internal resistance to those dark side energies, it's like sort of like Yoda, where we're trying to balance, our brain is kind of hardwired to protect us, but it's not always designed to help us be joyful. So our brain can sometimes really not be our best ally in this work. So, trying to find compassion is one of the most central ways that we can think about. And if I had to think about sort of psychotherapy in a nutshell, it's really like the way our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions interact with each other. And so at any point you can intervene with any of those things. And this is really, what I'll kind of leave you with is just, as we have trauma-informed systems, a lot of it is we're trying to work with trauma therapy principles to weave together identity with people to help them to feel like they're living a life that's more balanced, that is more compassionate, that is more loving towards themselves and towards others, but also that has boundaries, that are not going to allow themselves to be subject to exploitation, to reduce symptoms by improving safety for people, reducing inequity, having people be held accountable if they choose to hurt other people, reducing discriminatory practices that result in pain for Native communities, and social justice really being a practice of public health is really a principle that we sometimes forget, but it's very important. And then reducing stigma. And this is, I've been really inspired by many people, but, some of the, what is her name is Giselle Pellico in France, who had experienced sexual assault by her husband and, refused to be labeled as, the problem. And And she really demanded that the source of the predation be placed on the predators. And I think that that's one of the things I'd like to see happen. Even within our missing and murdered Indigenous women's efforts, sometimes you'll see predators who are leading those efforts, and I think that that's problematic. I think it's very painful for survivors to see, and there's ways that we can improve our access to culture, language, and healing. And that advocacy, can happen in places like this, in building places like this. As we think about community healing, those things are making a neurological mark on people's brains and on their hearts when they see communities gathering for good. We have trauma education for youth and providers that we can access, and that's really important. And we can support marginalized communities and identities, especially right now, our LGBTQ communities who've been really under attack. And how do we invest in ways to help them feel not only seen, included, but loved? That's like what our ultimate goal is. And how do we change narratives to be more about survivors being powerful, as opposed to being a source of future victimization or whatever things that have been placed on us. And then these are just some things that we think about in terms of service needs, and research as well. How we have partnerships, we have choice, respect. This is an area I've done work with our communities as well, and thinking about how do we voice concerns and access points. So yeah, something to think about as you all move forward. And I included this photo for you, for Kristen. So this is one of our ancestors. So Richard Sanderville, he's also known as Chief Bull for the Amskapi Pakani. And he wrote this, I don't know, gosh, when this would have been. He was sent to Carlisle Indian School, and he actually wanted to go there, for what I read, because it helped him to be able to become one of the first formal interpreters for the Blackfeet people, Blackfeet tribe. And he talked about, he also looks almost exactly like my dad. I will show you a picture. And so my dad was what we call like a grandma baby, because he looked a lot like Richard. But when I was a boy, very few members of my tribe could read or write, but now all of our young people are in school, and that is fine, but they're learning nothing about their own people and their own great chiefs. That is American history too. We are American history as well, and our histories and our lives matter in ways that can be promoted. Martin Luther King talks about this, the urgency of now, and how we think about, how do we revitalize? And that's why, like in our university, we have a planetarium where we have been able to share with you some of our star stories, where we talk about Indigenous revitalization and just bringing our stories back to life in our communities, and that spirit of Ika'akimat, that resiliency development, and how we think about that. But yeah, so that's all I have.
And what a beautiful presentation.
Hey, thank you.
About the work that you're doing and how basic it is and necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a quiet saga.
Yeah.
But thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. It's
Yeah.
really lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we will pause the live stream for a little bit and reset. Mike and Daniel can come up. We're going to take a little bit of a break too. And then we'll get started again. And let's have a conversation. Maybe based on some of what Andy spoke about, maybe something else. It'll be whatever happens. So give us a little bit of time to reset.
Before we break, we do want to recognize you.
Oh,
Thank you so much for being here. Everything you said today is just really deep resonated, and I kept wanting to look at everybody here and just say, oh my gosh, Annie just said that. Did you hear that? And so I feel like you began with Mike, with prayer, really set intentions for this week for our home. And I love it.
Oh, it makes
So, Will, we have some gifts for you. And this is our Grange to Rihanna and Olive. This is our tribal relations blanket. I know. Ooh, ah. So I'd like to gift you with this blanket.
Okay, sorry. Sit right side up. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So let's, if we could have our NASU folks. We also have some gifts from Woodring, some fun stuff. But NASU has also gifted you, and we also have some other things for you because we have treats.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us last year.
Yes.
Yeah, this is an extension of that. I know, I'm so excited.
You all need to know that the reason this is actually happening is because of all the work that Annie has done at the University of Montana. And for the last 2 years, we have attended the Matriarchal Storytelling Conference that Annie hosted. And we were so inspired every year that we wanted to bring that love and scholarship and heart to our place. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. Well, I'm just, I mean, that's all our community is, so yeah, so I just really just, all I'm doing is promoting that piece. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Yeah.